The storm broke over the Wyoming plains like judgment itself, and it was in the middle of that fury that Lillian Easton pounded her fist against Hugh Brenner's door, rain-soaked and trembling, and said the words that would change both their lives forever. "I've got a bounty on my head and nowhere left to hide." Hugh Brenner stood in the doorway with a lamp raised in one hand, its light catching the rain sliding off the brim of her hat and the desperation carved into her face. She was young, maybe 24, with dark hair plastered to her cheeks, and eyes the color of creek water after a flood, gray-green and churning. Behind her, thunder rolled across the Laramie foothills and lightning split the sky over the ridge that gave his ranch its name. He did not ask her name first. He did not ask what she had done. He looked past her shoulder into the black, storm-lashed prairie, saw nothing but rain and the shapes of his own fence posts, and he stepped back to let her in. Then, without a word, he shut the door and threw the iron bolt across it. "Sit by the fire," he said. "You look near to freezing." She stood rooted to the floorboards, water pooling beneath her boots, staring at him as though she expected him to change his mind and throw her back out into the storm. "You did not hear me," she said. "I said there is a bounty on my head. Men are looking for me. If they find me here, they will not care that this is your house." "I heard you fine." Hugh set the lamp on the table and reached for a folded blanket draped over the back of a chair. "Now sit down before you catch your death, and then you can tell me the whole of it if you are of a mind to." It was the year 1879, in the high, wind-scoured country of the Wyoming Territory, some 30 miles from the raw young town of Cedar Bluff, which had sprung up 2 years before along the stage road that ran between Cheyenne and the mining camps to the north. Hugh Brenner's ranch sat in a shallow valley beneath a ridge of red rock, 500 head of cattle, and a house he had built himself, board by board, after he had turned in his deputy's badge and ridden away from Cheyenne with nothing but a horse, a rifle, and a bitterness he had not yet learned to set down. He was 31 years old, broad through the shoulders, with sun-weathered skin and a quiet way of moving that came from years of being the only man in a room who did not need to prove himself. He lived alone. He had lived alone for 3 years, ever since the trouble in Cheyenne, and he had told himself he preferred it that way. But something in the woman's voice, in the way she held herself even as she trembled, made him think that solitude was a poor sort of company for a night like this. Lillian let him drape the blanket over her shoulders. She sat at the edge of the chair he pulled out for her, close enough to the fire to feel its heat, but not so close as to seem she had claimed a place there. Water dripped from the hem of her skirt onto his floor, and she watched it fall as though ashamed of the mess she was making. "I did not mean to bring trouble to your door," she said. "I saw the light of your window from the road, and I had ridden so long, and my horse threw a shoe 2 miles back, and I have been walking since dark. I did not know whose house this was." "It is Hugh Brenner's house," he said, "and you are welcome to its fire whether you know whose it is or not. You should know what you are welcoming in before you say that. Then tell me." She was quiet a long moment, staring into the flames. The rain hammered the roof above them, and somewhere out past the barn a shutter banged loose and free. Hugh did not press her. He set a pot of coffee on the stove and let the silence sit between them until she was ready to fill it, the way a man waits out a spooked horse rather than forcing the lead rope. "My name is Lillian Easton," she said at last. "I am wanted in the territory of Nebraska, and likely by now in this one too, for the murder of my husband, Silas Vance." Hugh's hand stilled on the coffee pot. He turned to look at her fully for the first time since she had stepped inside, taking in the hollows beneath her eyes, the thinness of her wrists where her sleeves had ridden up, the way her jaw set even as her voice shook. "Did you kill him?" he asked, and there was no accusation in it, only a plain question that deserved a plain answer. "Yes," she said. "I shot him in our own bedroom with his own pistol because he had beaten me half senseless 3 times that month, and on the 4th time he told me he meant to finish it. I do not deny what I did. I would do it again tonight if I had to." But his father is Judge Elias Vance, And Judge Vance has more money and more friends in more courthouses than any woman fleeing on a lame horse could ever hope to outrun. And he has put $500 on my head and called it murder instead of what it was." The fire popped. Outside, the storm seemed, for a moment, to hold its breath. $500, Hugh said quietly. "That is enough to turn half the drifters and bounty men in 3 territories toward Wyoming." "I know it," Lillian said. "I have felt them behind me for 6 weeks now. I have slept in barns and dry creek beds, and once in a hollowed-out stump because I heard riders on the road and I did not know if they were looking for me. I am so tired, Mr. Brenner. I am so tired of running that some nights I have thought it might almost be a mercy to let them catch me and be done with it." "Do not talk that way," Hugh said, sharper than he intended, and then softer. "You said your name was Easton." "Easton was my mother's name. I have not called myself Vance since the night I left that house, and I do not intend to again." Hugh nodded slowly, as though that settled something in his mind. He poured 2 cups of coffee, black and strong, and set one before her. "Well, Lillian Easton," he said, "you are not sleeping in a hollow stump tonight. You will sleep here by this fire, and in the morning we will see about your horse and about what is to be done next. Nobody is coming through that door tonight who has not got a key, and I am the only man who owns one." She looked up at him with an expression he would remember for the rest of his life. Somewhere between disbelief and a hope she seemed almost afraid to let herself feel. "You do not know me," she said. "You do not know if I am telling the truth. I know a woman who rode 2 lame miles through a Wyoming thunderstorm rather than lie down and quit," Hugh said. "That tells me something. The rest, I expect, you will tell me in time if you choose to stay." "I have nowhere else to go," she admitted. "Then it is settled," Hugh said, and for the first time that night, something like a smile touched the corner of his mouth. "You will stay until you have somewhere better to be, and not one day before." He gave her his own bed that night, though she protested twice before accepting, and took a bedroll for himself on the floor before the hearth, his rifle laid within easy reach of his hand. He did not sleep deeply. Every creak of the house, every gust that rattled the shutters, brought his eyes open, and more than once he rose to look out at the black yard, watching for a shape that was not rain or wind. But nothing came that night save the storm itself, and by morning it had blown itself out over the eastern plains, leaving the world washed clean and glittering with runoff. Lillian woke to the smell of biscuits and the sound of a man moving carefully through his own kitchen so as not to wake her. She lay still a moment, disoriented by the strange bed and the soft gray light coming through a window she did not recognize. And then the memory of the night before came back to her in a rush, and with it a fear that Hugh Brenner might have reconsidered in the daylight what he had offered so readily in the dark. But when she came out, dressed and hesitant, he only glanced up from the stove and said, "There is coffee, and there will be biscuits directly if you can stand my cooking. I am better with cattle than with an oven, I will warn you now." "I can cook," she said, "if you would let me." "I would be glad of it," Hugh said, and stepped aside from the stove as if he had been waiting for her to offer. That was how the first days went between them, small offerings and small acceptances, each one a stone laid down to build something neither of them named aloud. Lillian cooked, and mended a torn shirt she found folded in a basket by the door, and swept the floor of a house that had clearly gone a long while without a woman's touch, though she did it not as payment for his kindness, but because her hands needed something to do besides shake with the fear that had ridden with her for 6 weeks. Hugh went out to see to the herd and to walk the fence line, and when he came back at midday she had a meal on the table that made him stop in the doorway and simply look at it, and at her, for a long moment before he said anything at all. "You did not have to do all this," he said. "I wanted to," she said. "It is the least I can do for a man who locked his door against strangers on my account." "I locked the door to keep you safe," Hugh said, "not to keep myself comfortable. Though I will admit," he added, glancing at the table, "I have not eaten this well since my mother passed." It was the first time either of them had spoken of family, and Lillian looked up, curious despite herself. "Where is your family, Mr. Brenner?" "Call me Hugh," he said. "We are past formalities, I think, given the circumstances. My mother is buried in Missouri, alongside my father who went before her. I have a sister in Ohio I write to twice a year and see never. And I had a badge and a job in Cheyenne once, until I learned what kind of men wear badges alongside me, and I decided I would rather wear none at all than wear one dishonestly." Lillian's spoon stilled over her plate. "You were a lawman, a deputy for 4 years," Hugh said, and something in his face closed like a shutter drawn against weather. "I do not talk of it much. But I will tell you this, since you have trusted me with your own trouble. I know exactly how a man with money can bend a court to his purposes, because I watched it happen with my own eyes to a man who did not deserve what came to him. So when you tell me Judge Elias Vance has bought himself a bounty and called it justice, I do not doubt you for one moment." "What happened?" Lillian asked. "In Cheyenne." Hugh was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. Then he set down his fork and folded his hands together on the table's edge. "There was a rancher named Tobias Reyes," he said. "A Mexican man, good with horses, married to a fine woman with 2 children. He had a dispute over water rights with a cattle baron who had the ear of half the judges in the territory. The baron's son got drunk one night and rode his horse straight through Reyes's fence and into his garden, and Reyes told him to get off his land, and there was a scuffle, and the baron's son ended up with a broken arm from falling off his own horse in his own drunkenness. But when the son came up, it was Reyes sitting in the jail charged with assault, and by the time the circuit judge came through, that charge had grown into attempted murder, on testimony bought and paid for. I was the deputy who had to walk him to that courtroom, and I watched him sentenced to hang for a thing that happened because a rich man's son could not hold his liquor and would not admit his own fault." "Did they hang him?" Lillian's voice had gone very quiet. "No," Hugh said. "I got him out of that jail 2 nights before the sentence was to be carried out, and I put him on a horse and told him to ride for Mexico and never come back to Wyoming territory as long as he lived. I do not know if he made it. I have never heard, one way or the other. But I turned in my badge the next morning because I could not wear it and live with what I had seen it protect." Lillian reached across the table, an instinct more than a decision, and laid her hand over his. "That was a brave thing to do." "It was the only thing I knew how to do," Hugh said, turning his hand beneath hers so that their palms met. "I have thought since then that justice on paper and justice in truth are not always the same animal, no matter what any judge's gavel might say. So you will forgive me if I do not put much stock in a bounty poster with Elias Vance's money behind it." They sat like that a while, hands joined over the remains of a meal neither of them was in any hurry to finish, and something passed between them that was not yet love, not so soon, but was surely its first seed, planted in the shared soil of 2 people who had each seen the world's injustice up close, and had each, in their own way, refused to bow to it. The weeks that followed took on a rhythm neither of them had expected to find comfort in. Lillian worked the house and, in time, worked the yard as well, learning to milk the 2 cows Hugh kept, learning the names of his horses, learning which hens laid best and which were merely ornamental and stubborn. Hugh, in turn, began to teach her other things: how to load and fire the old Colt revolver he kept in a drawer, how to saddle a horse quickly in the dark should she ever need to run again, how to read the sky for weather so she would never again be caught in a storm with nowhere to shelter. "I hope you never need any of this," he told her one evening, as she practiced drawing the hammer back on the Colt with steadier hands than she had shown a month before. "But I would rather you know it and never need it than need it and not know." "You have thought a great deal about my needing it," Lillian observed. "I think about it more than I would like to admit," Hugh said, and there was something rough in his voice that made her look up from the pistol and meet his eyes. "Lillian, I do not know what is coming. Bounty men are patient, and Elias Vance is patient with other men's money. Somebody someday is going to come looking, and I mean for you to be ready if they do." "And you?" she asked. "Will you be ready?" "I have been ready since the night I bolted that door," Hugh said simply. It was around this time that Lillian first rode with him into Cedar Bluff, though she went veiled and cautious, her hat pulled low and a borrowed coat too large for her shoulders disguising her shape. The town was little more than a single dusty street lined with false-fronted buildings, a general store, a livery, a saloon with a false second story that fooled no one, and a small clapboard church that doubled as a schoolhouse on weekdays. But it had a life to it, a hum of voices and horse traffic and children chasing a dog between the buildings, and Lillian found herself unexpectedly moved by the ordinariness of it, the sight of people simply living their lives without the weight of a bounty poster hanging over their heads. "There is a poster," Hugh told her quietly as they walked their horses past the general store, "in the marshal's office. I have seen it. It does not have a likeness, only a description, which is a mercy since a description could fit half the women in this territory. But I would rather you not linger in town longer than you must, not until we know more of who is looking and how close they have come." "How do you know so much of what is in the marshal's office?" Lillian asked. "Because the marshal here, Ezra Coombs, is an old friend from before Cheyenne," Hugh said. "A fair man, as lawmen go. I have told him nothing of you, but I have asked him, in a general way, to let me know if any bounty men come sniffing around asking after a woman traveling alone. He has agreed to it, no questions asked, because he trusts me, and because he has no love for Elias Vance either. Vance tried to buy his office 2 years back and Coombs ran him out of town with nothing but a hard look and a refusal. I owe him my thanks then, even if he does not know my name." "He does not need to know your name to earn it," Hugh said. "Come, let us get what we need and be gone before the sun gets much higher." It was on the ride home from that trip, with the sun sliding low and gold over the ridgeline and the cattle lowing in the distance, that Hugh first found himself unable to look away from her for longer than was polite. She rode well now, better than she had when she arrived, her back straight and her hands sure on the reins, and the borrowed coat had slipped back off one shoulder to reveal the curve of her, and the low light caught in her dark hair like something out of a painting he had once seen in a Cheyenne parlor and never forgotten. He looked away before she caught him staring, but not quickly enough, and when he glanced back, she was smiling faintly at the ground. "You may look at me, Hugh Brenner," she said. "I do not mind it. I was minding my own manners," he said, though his ears had gone red beneath his hat. "Your manners have been impeccable since the night I arrived," Lillian said. "Perhaps too impeccable. A woman might begin to wonder if a man found her disagreeable to look at." "I have found no such thing," Hugh said, more quickly than he intended, and she laughed, a real laugh, bright and unguarded, the first he had heard from her since her arrival, and the sound of it did something to his chest that he did not have a name for yet, though he suspected he would come to. That night after supper, they sat together on the porch as the stars came out over the ridge, and Lillian told him more of her life before Cheyenne, before the bounty, before Silas Vance had ever entered it. She had grown up in Missouri, the daughter of a schoolteacher and a carpenter, both dead now of a fever that had taken half their small town one hard winter when she was 19. She had gone to Nebraska to live with an aunt, and it was there she had met Silas, charming at first, generous with gifts and words, until the marriage had made a different man visible beneath the courtship. A man with a temper that grew shorter and hands that grew rougher as the months went on. "I stayed longer than I should have," she admitted, staring out at the dark shapes of the cattle grazing beyond the fence. "I kept thinking I could reach the man I had married at first, that he was still in there somewhere, buried under whatever had made him cruel. I was a fool for that, I think now." "You were not a fool," Hugh said. "You were hopeful. There is a difference, even if hope sometimes costs us dear." "It cost me everything," Lillian said. "My home, my name, my safety. The only thing I have left is my own life, and even that is not mine so long as there is a price on it." Hugh turned to look at her then, and in the moonlight her face was pale and lovely and terribly sad, and something in him that had been guarded for 3 long years since Cheyenne simply gave way, like a dam that had held back more water than it was ever built to hold. "Your life is yours," he said, low and fierce. "I do not care what any poster says, or what any judge with a rich man's money in his pocket has decided to call it. You defended yourself against a man who meant to kill you, and if that is murder, then I do not know what justice means anymore, and I have spent enough of my life trying to understand it to have earned an opinion." "You cannot fight Elias Vance's money with opinions, Hugh." "No," he agreed, "but I can fight it with the truth if the truth can be found and brought before the right eyes. There must be someone in Nebraska who saw what Silas Vance was, who knows what he did to you. A neighbor, a housekeeper, someone who is not afraid of the Vance name." Lillian's breath caught. "There was a housekeeper, Mrs. Doreen Halloway. She worked for us the last year of my marriage, and she saw more than once what Silas did, the bruises, the night I finally ran. She begged me to leave sooner than I did. If anyone would speak the truth of it, it would be her." "Then that is where we begin," Hugh said, "if you are willing." "Begin what exactly?" "Clearing your name," Hugh said, as though it were the simplest thing in the world, though both of them knew it was not. "I am not content to hide you here forever, Lillian, much as I have come to treasure having you under my roof. A life built on hiding is not a life. You deserve to walk into any town in this territory without a hat pulled low over your eyes." Lillian's eyes filled unexpectedly, and she looked away quickly, embarrassed by the sudden rush of feeling. "Why do you care so much what becomes of me? You did not know me a month ago." Hugh considered the question seriously before he answered, as though it deserved more than a glib response. "I think," he said slowly, "that I have spent 3 years alone on this ridge, telling myself I preferred the quiet, and then a woman came pounding on my door in a thunderstorm and told me the truth about herself before she had any reason to trust I would not turn around and collect the reward myself. That kind of honesty offered to a stranger at her most desperate hour is not a small thing, Lillian. I do not think I have stopped thinking about it or about you since that night." "Hugh, I am not finished," he said gently. "I care what becomes of you because somewhere in these past weeks, without much meaning to, I have fallen in love with you. I did not plan it. I'm not sure it is wise, given all that hangs over your head. But it is true, and I would rather say it plainly than let it sit unspoken between us like a debt neither of us will collect." The night was very quiet then, save for the wind moving through the grass and the distant call of some night bird settling into the dark. Lillian looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for something, and whatever she found there seemed to satisfy her, because she reached up and touched his cheek, roughened with a day's stubble, and said, "I think I fell in love with you the night you locked that door. I have been too afraid to say it because I did not want to bring you into more danger than I already have simply by being here. But I am tired of being afraid of everything, Hugh. I would rather be afraid of one true thing than 100 imagined ones." He kissed her then softly, as though she were something that might startle and run if he moved too fast, and she leaned into him, with a sigh that seemed to carry away some of the long weight she had been hauling across 3 territories in 6 hard weeks. When they finally drew apart, both of them were smiling, foolishly, helplessly, the way people smile when something long feared has turned out, against all expectation, to be something wonderful instead. "We will write to this Mrs. Halloway," Hugh said, his hand still resting against her jaw, "and we will find whatever truth there is to find. But whatever comes of it, Lillian Easton, I want you to know that I am not letting you go. Bounty or no bounty, judge's son or no judge's son, you are staying if you will have me." "I will have you," Lillian said, and kissed him again to prove it. The letter to Nebraska took nearly 3 weeks to receive an answer, 3 weeks in which the ranch work continued, and the romance between them deepened in small, daily ways. A hand brushed against another while passing a plate, a lingering look across the supper table, an evening spent teaching her to two-step to a fiddle tune Hugh hummed himself, since there was no music to be had for 30 miles, both of them laughing at his poor rhythm and her poor footwork, until they collapsed onto the porch steps breathless and happy. But the peace of those weeks was not to last uninterrupted. On a bright, windless afternoon near the end of that third week, a rider came up the road to Brenner Ridge that neither of them recognized, and Hugh's hand went instinctively to the rifle propped by the door before he saw it was Ezra Coombs himself, the town marshal, riding hard and alone. "Hugh," Coombs called, swinging down from his horse before it had fully stopped. "I need a word, and I think you will want your guest to hear it too if she is about." Lillian came out from the kitchen, wiping flour from her hands, and Hugh saw her face go pale at the sight of the marshal's grim expression. "There is a man in town," Coombs said without preamble, "calling himself Jed Coltrane. Bounty hunter, and not a gentle one from what I hear tell. He has been asking after a woman traveling alone, dark hair, gray eyes, answering roughly to the description on a poster he is carrying from Nebraska. He showed it to me himself, bold as you please, and asked if I had seen anyone matching it in these parts." "What did you tell him?" Hugh asked, his voice tight. "I told him this territory is full of dark-haired women, and I could not be expected to remember every traveler through Cedar Bluff," Coombs said. "But he is not a stupid man, Hugh. He has been asking at the livery too, and I do not doubt he will ask at every ranch within 20 miles before he gives up the search. He has the scent of that $500 in his nose, and men like that do not let go easily." Lillian's hand had found Hugh's arm, gripping tight. "How long before he comes here?" "A day, maybe 2 if he is thorough," Coombs said. "I came ahead to warn you since Hugh here asked me to keep an ear open, and I do not forget a favor asked in good faith. But I cannot hold him off forever, and I will not lie to a lawful bounty hunter if he asks me a direct question and I have no honest way around it." "You have done more than enough already, Ezra," Hugh said. "I will not ask you to lie for us. Thank you for the warning." Coombs nodded, glancing once more at Lillian with an expression that held no judgment, only a weary sort of sympathy. "For what it is worth, ma'am, I have heard rumors out of Nebraska about Judge Vance and the manner of man his son was. I do not know the whole truth of your circumstance, and I do not need to, but I have seen enough bought justice in my years wearing this badge to know it when I smell it. I wish you luck, whatever you decide to do." He rode off as quickly as he had come, leaving Hugh and Lillian standing together in the yard, the afternoon sun suddenly feeling less bright than it had a few minutes before. "We cannot wait for the letter from Mrs. Halloway," Lillian said, her voice tight with fear she was fighting to control. "Not if he is already this close." "No," Hugh agreed. "We cannot, but we cannot outrun him forever either, Lillian. Running is what you have been doing for 6 weeks, and it has worn you thin as a rail. I think it is time we stopped running and went toward the truth instead of away from the danger." "What do you mean?" "I mean we go to Nebraska ourselves," Hugh said. "We find Mrs. Halloway in person, and if she will give her testimony, we take it to a judge who is not in Elias Vance's pocket, a federal judge if we must go that high, and we make this right instead of merely hiding from the wrong of it." "That is a dangerous road, Hugh. If Coltrane finds us on it, or if we are seen in Nebraska at all, it is dangerous," Hugh admitted. "But so is standing still and waiting for a bounty hunter to walk up my own front steps. I would rather move towards something than cower from everything. Will you come with me?" Lillian looked at him for a long moment, and then slowly she nodded. "I will. I am done being afraid of my own shadow, Hugh Brenner. If we are to fight this, then let us fight it together." They left Brenner Ridge 2 mornings later, before the sun had fully cleared the ridge, with saddlebags packed light and fast horses beneath them, Hugh's rifle slung across his back, and Lillian's borrowed colt riding at her hip, loaded now with a steady hand that had practiced for exactly this possibility. Hugh left the ranch in the care of a neighboring rancher, a widower named Amos Prout who owed him more than one favor, and asked no questions in return for the promise of future ones repaid. They rode south and east, avoiding the main stage road where they could, keeping to lesser trails through the foothills and across the open plains, sleeping rough beneath the stars and taking turns at watch through the night. It was on the 3rd night of that journey, camped in a shallow draw beside a dry creek bed with only a small fire for warmth, that Lillian woke Hugh from a light sleep with a hand on his shoulder and fear plain in her whisper. "Hugh, there are riders. I heard horses on the ridge above us." Hugh was up in an instant, rifle in hand, moving to kick dirt over the last embers of their fire so no glow would betray their position. He listened hard into the dark, and after a long moment he heard it too, the distant clop of shod hooves on rocky ground, moving slow, as though searching rather than simply traveling through. "Get the horses," he said quietly. "Quiet as you can. We move on foot until we are clear of this draw." They led their horses through the dark for nearly a mile, Lillian's heart hammering with every snap of brush beneath her boots, until the sound of the riders faded behind them, and Hugh judged it safe enough to mount again. They rode hard through what remained of the night, putting distance between themselves and whoever had been searching the ridge, and did not stop again until dawn broke gray and cold over a landscape neither of them recognized. "Was that him?" Lillian asked, once they had caught their breath and let the horses drink from a shallow stream. "Coltrane." "I do not know," Hugh admitted. "Could have been drovers moving cattle at a strange hour, or could have been exactly who you fear. I would rather we assume the worst and be wrong than assume the best and be caught unprepared." They pressed on, and 2 days later, travel-worn and weary, they crossed into Nebraska territory and found the small town where Mrs. Doreen Halloway was said still to live. A modest place called Willow Creek, with a church steeple visible from a mile off, and a general store that seemed to serve as the town's entire commercial district. Hugh left Lillian concealed at the edge of town, veiled and cautious once more, while he went in alone to ask discreet questions of the storekeeper, an elderly man who, once assured Hugh was no friend of the Vance family, was more than willing to point the way to Mrs. Halloway's small house on the town's northern edge. Doreen Halloway proved to be a stout, gray-haired woman with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, who answered her door with a rolling pin still in hand as though she expected trouble and intended to meet it head-on. When Hugh explained carefully who had sent him and why, her expression softened into something like grief mixed with relief. "Lillian sent you," she said. "Lord above, I have prayed for that girl every night since she ran. Is she safe? Is she well?" "She is safe, and she is close by, though I have left her hidden until I knew it was safe to bring her forward," Hugh said. "Mrs. Halloway, I need to ask something difficult of you. Would you be willing to speak the truth of what you saw in that house, before a judge, even knowing what it might cost you with a family as powerful as the Vances?" Doreen Halloway's eyes hardened, and she set the rolling pin down on a side table with a decisive click. "Young man, I have kept my silence out of fear for 2 years, and it has sat in my belly like a stone every day since. That girl did not murder anyone. She defended her own life against a man who beat her black and blue more times than I care to count. A man his own father knew was cruel and chose to protect anyway, because the family name mattered more to Elias Vance than his own son's soul. I will speak the truth before any judge in this territory or the next, and I will do it gladly, if it means that poor girl can finally stop running." Lillian was brought in from her hiding place then, and the reunion between the two women was a tearful one, full of embraces and half-finished sentences, and Doreen Halloway scolding Lillian gently for looking so thin and worn even as she held her tight enough to nearly crack a rib. Over the following hours, seated at Doreen's kitchen table with strong tea going cold between them, the older woman told Hugh everything she had witnessed during her year in the Vance household. The bruises she had seen and tended, the night she had heard Silas Vance's raised voice through the walls, and found Lillian the next morning with a split lip she claimed came from a fall. The final terrible night when Lillian had come to her in a state of shock, the pistol still in her hand, saying only that Silas had told her he meant to kill her, and she had believed him with her whole heart, and had acted before he could make good on the threat. "I helped her get her horse saddled that very night," Doreen said, wiping her eyes with the corner of her apron. "I told her to run and not look back, and I have regretted every day since that I did not run with her, or at least that I did not speak up sooner to stop things ever getting that far. I will not make that mistake of silence again." "Would you be willing to travel?" Hugh asked. "There is a federal judge who circuits through Cheyenne, a man named Judge Warren Cassell, known for fairness even where local politics run thick with corruption. If we can bring your testimony before him, along with a formal petition, there is a real chance the charge against Lillian could be reduced or even dismissed outright, especially once it is shown that Elias Vance placed the bounty using his personal influence rather than any lawful territorial process. I will travel to the ends of the earth if it clears that girl's name," Doreen said firmly. "Give me 2 days to arrange things here, and I will ride with you to Cheyenne myself." The 2 days passed in careful preparation, Hugh sending a discreet letter ahead to Cheyenne to inquire after Judge Cassell's circuit schedule, using a name and phrasing vague enough not to draw undue attention should the letter fall into the wrong hands. It was during this brief respite, in the relative safety of Doreen Holloway's small house, that Lillian and Hugh found a quiet evening alone on the back porch, the Nebraska plains stretching flat and endless beneath a sky just beginning to purple with dusk. "I am afraid," Lillian admitted, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Even with Doreen's testimony, even with a fair judge, Elias Vance has resources we cannot match." "What if it is not enough?" "Then we will find more," Hugh said simply. "We will not stop until it is enough, Lillian. I did not ride 4 days across 2 territories to watch you hang for defending your own life. Whatever it takes, we will find it." "You have given up so much for me already," Lillian said. "Your peace, your solitude, perhaps even your safety, if Coltrane or worse comes looking for us both now. I do not know how I will ever repay such a thing." "You need not repay it," Hugh said, turning to look at her fully, his hand finding hers in the gathering dark. "Lillian, I told you once that I had fallen in love with you, and I meant it then and I mean it more now, having seen you fight for your own truth instead of simply running from it. When this is done, when your name is cleared and this bounty is nothing but old ink on a forgotten poster, I want to marry you. I do not want to wait any longer than we must to make that plain between us." Lillian's breath caught, and tears sprang unbidden to her eyes, though this time they were not tears of fear. "You are asking me to marry you in the middle of all this danger, Hugh Brenner." "I am asking you to marry me because of all this danger," Hugh said. "Because I have learned, watching you these past months, that I do not want to face a single hard thing in this world without you beside me, and I would rather ask you now plainly than wait for some safer moment that may never come. Life does not often offer safe moments, Lillian. It only offers true ones if we are brave enough to take them." "Then yes," Lillian said, laughing through her tears. "Yes, I will marry you, Hugh Brenner, bounty or no bounty, danger or no danger. I have never been more certain of anything in my life." They kissed there on Doreen Holloway's back porch beneath the darkening Nebraska sky, and somewhere inside the little house, unseen but not unheard, Doreen Holloway wiped a tear from her own eye and smiled to herself, thinking that perhaps some good might yet come from all the sorrow that had brought these two together. The ride to Cheyenne took the better part of a week, the 3 of them traveling together now, Doreen proving herself sturdier in the saddle than her age might have suggested, insisting she had ridden plenty in her younger days, and was not about to let a little dust and distance slow her down when justice was at stake. They arrived in Cheyenne on a warm afternoon in early autumn, the town bustling with the traffic of the territorial capital, far larger and louder than either Cedar Bluff or Willow Creek, full of freight wagons and fine carriages, and the particular energy of a place where power and money moved in equal measure. It was here, in this town Hugh had once called home, and had left under such bitter circumstances, that the final and most dangerous part of their journey would play out. Hugh sent word ahead through a contact he still trusted, a court clerk named Marcus Ainsley, who had been sympathetic to the Rays case years before, and had quietly disapproved of the corruption he had watched take root in the territorial courts since. Ainsley confirmed that Judge Warren Cassell was indeed in Cheyenne that week, holding circuit court in the main courthouse, and that he had a reputation, hard won and closely guarded, for refusing bribes and favors that other judges accepted as a matter of course. He is not an easy man to sway, Ainsley warned, meeting them in a quiet back room of the boarding house where they had taken rooms under assumed names. But he is not an easy man to buy either, and in a territory like this one, that makes him rarer than gold. If you can get a hearing before him, and if Mrs. Halloway's testimony holds up under his questioning, you have a real chance. And if Elias Vance learns we are here before we can secure that hearing, Hugh asked, then I would expect he sends men to make sure that hearing never happens, Ainsley said grimly. I would move quickly, Hugh, and quietly if I were you. They moved quickly indeed, Ainsley using his position to secure a hearing before Judge Cassell within 2 days' time, filed under a petition for review of an improperly issued bounty, a legal maneuver that Hugh, drawing on his old knowledge of territorial law, knew was their best chance of forcing an official examination of the charges against Lillian, without her having to surrender herself first into a jail cell where Vance's influence might reach her more easily. But word travels fast in a territorial capital, and it was on the very evening before the scheduled hearing that trouble finally caught up with them in the form of Jed Coltrane himself, who had apparently tracked their trail with more skill and persistence than Hugh had credited him for. He came upon them in the alley behind the boarding house as Hugh was seeing to the horses, a lean, hard-eyed man with a scattergun cradled easy in his arms and a bounty poster folded in his breast pocket. Brenner, Coltrane said, recognizing him from some old Cheyenne acquaintance. Heard you left the badge behind a few years back. Did not expect to find you harboring a fugitive clear across 2 territories. She is no fugitive, Hugh said, standing his ground, one hand resting near his own holstered pistol though he made no move to draw it first. She is a woman who defended her own life, and there is a federal judge in this town tomorrow who is going to hear the truth of it. Truth does not pay my bills, Coltrane said. $500 does. I have been 3 months on this trail, Brenner, and I do not intend to ride home empty-handed on account of your sudden fondness for justice. Then you will have to go through me, Hugh said quietly, and I do not think you want to do that in the middle of Cheyenne with a federal judge sitting a few streets over, ready to hear how Elias Vance bought himself a bounty. That story would not sit well with anyone who might be watching from a window right now, and this street has plenty of windows. Coltrane's eyes flickered, calculating, and for a long moment the alley held its breath, the scattergun's barrel wavering slightly as the bounty hunter weighed his odds. It was Lillian's voice, calm and clear, that finally broke the tension, as she stepped out from the boarding house's back door where she had been listening, unwilling to let Hugh face this danger alone. Mr. Coltrane, she said, tomorrow morning, before Judge Cassell, the truth of what happened between myself and Silas Vance will be made plain, along with the truth of how that bounty came to exist in the first place. If you take me in tonight by force before that hearing, you will be helping Elias Vance bury evidence of his own corruption, and I do not think that is a reputation you want attached to your name once the full story comes to light, as it surely will. But if you wait one day and let that hearing proceed, I promise you this, whatever the court's ruling, you will have brought in the woman named on that poster, alive and unharmed, and no one, not even Vance, can fault you for collecting whatever legitimate reward remains once the truth is sorted. Coltrane studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his hard eyes. You are a cool one, he said finally. Most folks in your position would be begging or running, not negotiating terms with the man come to collect on their head. I have done enough running, Lillian said. I would rather face this squarely. Coltrane lowered the scattergun slowly, though he did not put it away entirely. One day, he said, I will be at that hearing myself to see how this truth of yours holds up, but if it does not hold, ma'am, I will collect what I came for, and I will not feel a moment's guilt over it. That is fair, Lillian said, and something in her steady acceptance of the risk seemed to earn a grudging respect from the bounty hunter, who nodded once sharply and disappeared back into the Cheyenne night without further threat. That was either very brave or very foolish, Hugh said, once Coltrane's footsteps had faded. Perhaps it was both, Lillian said, though her hands were shaking now that the danger had passed, and Hugh gathered her into his arms and held her there in the alley until the shaking stopped, both of them grateful beyond words that the night had not ended in violence. The hearing before Judge Warren Cassell took place the following morning in a courtroom far smaller and plainer than the grandeur of the territorial capital might have suggested. A simple room with wooden benches and tall windows letting in the pale autumn light. Judge Cassell himself was an older man, silver-haired and stern-faced, with the kind of eyes that seemed to have seen every manner of deception a courtroom could offer, and had long since learned to see straight through most of it. Marcus Ainslie presented the petition with careful precision, laying out the circumstances of the bounty's issuance, the questionable process by which Elias Vance had used his personal influence and wealth to circumvent proper territorial channels in placing so large a reward on a woman never formally charged through any legitimate court proceeding. Then Doreen Holloway took the stand, and her testimony, delivered in a steady, unflinching voice, painted a picture of Silas Vance's cruelty and Lillian's desperate self-defense that left more than one observer in the gallery visibly moved. Jed Coltrane sat near the back of the courtroom throughout, arms crossed, watching with an unreadable expression that gave away nothing of his intentions, and Lillian felt his presence like a weight throughout the proceedings, uncertain until the very end whether he intended to honor his word or seize her the moment the gavel fell regardless of the outcome. Elias Vance himself had not traveled to Cheyenne, apparently confident that his influence would render his personal presence unnecessary, but he had sent a lawyer, a slick, well-dressed man named Percival Grimm, who attempted throughout the hearing to paint Lillian as a scheming woman who had murdered her husband for his inheritance and fled justice ever since. But Grimm's arguments grew thinner with each witness, especially once Judge Cassell, in his careful, methodical way, began asking pointed questions about the exact legal process by which the bounty had been issued, questions that Grimm could not answer satisfactorily because, as Hugh had suspected all along, there had been no proper legal process at all, only the raw exercise of a wealthy man's grief and rage, funneled through hired men and printed posters with no court's authority behind them. "It is the opinion of this court," Judge Cassell said finally, after nearly 2 hours of testimony and argument, his voice carrying clearly through the small room, that the bounty in question was issued without proper legal foundation, representing a private vendetta rather than a lawful warrant, and is therefore null and void under the laws of this territory. Furthermore, having heard the testimony of Mrs. Doreen Holloway regarding the circumstances of Silas Vance's death, this court finds sufficient evidence of justified self-defense to warrant a full dismissal of any charge against Lillian Easton. She is a free woman, with no lawful claim against her, from this day forward. The courtroom seemed to exhale as one, and Lillian felt Hugh's hand find hers, gripping tight, both of them fighting back tears of relief that 6 long weeks of running and months of danger had finally, truly ended. From the back of the courtroom, Jed Coltrane rose without a word, tipped his hat once in Lillian's direction, an odd, almost respectful gesture from a man who had come to collect a bounty and was leaving with nothing but the memory of watching justice, for once, actually served. He walked out of the courthouse and out of their lives, and neither of them ever saw him again, though Hugh would later hear, secondhand, that Coltrane had taken up honest ranch work somewhere in Montana, as though the whole affair had shaken something loose in him as well. Percival Grimm gathered his papers with a face like curdled milk and departed without another word, presumably to send an unhappy telegram to his employer in Nebraska. Elias Vance, for his part, made no further attempt to pursue the matter, whether from a grudging acceptance of the court's ruling or simple exhaustion of the fight, and the bounty poster that had haunted Lillian's every waking hour for months was, within the week, officially rescinded and pulled from every marshal's office and post board across 2 territories. Outside the courthouse, in the bright autumn sunshine of a Cheyenne afternoon, Lillian turned to Hugh with tears streaming freely down her face now, tears she no longer needed to hide or explain. "It is over," she said, as though she could not quite believe the words even as she spoke them. "Hugh, it is truly over." "It is over," Hugh agreed, gathering her into his arms right there on the courthouse steps, uncaring of who might see. "You are free, Lillian Easton, free to walk any street in this territory with your head held high, and free, if you will still have me, to become Lillian Brenner whenever and wherever you choose." "I choose now," Lillian said, laughing through her tears. "I have waited long enough for everything else in this life. I do not intend to wait any longer for that." They were married 2 weeks later, back in Cedar Bluff, in the small clapboard church that doubled as a schoolhouse, with Marshal Ezra Coombs standing as witness and Doreen Holloway, who had traveled with them all the way from Nebraska and declared she had no intention of missing such an occasion, weeping happily in the front pew. Amos Prout, the neighboring rancher who had watched over Brenner Ridge in their absence, provided a fiddle player for the small celebration that followed, and half the town of Cedar Bluff turned out for the dancing and the feasting. Curious townsfolk who had heard whispers of the remarkable story now come to see for themselves the woman who had ridden into their territory as a fugitive and ridden out of the Cheyenne courthouse as a free woman, about to become the wife of one of their own. Lillian wore a simple dress of pale blue, borrowed and altered by Doreen's capable hands, with wildflowers gathered from the ridge woven through her dark hair, and when Hugh saw her walk up the short aisle toward him, he felt something in his chest swell so full he thought it might burst clean out of him. The vows they spoke were simple and plain, without flourish, because both of them had learned by now that the truest things in life rarely needed much decoration to shine. "I take you, Lillian Easton," Hugh said, his voice thick with emotion, "to stand beside through whatever storms may come, as I stood beside you through the first and every one since. You are the truest thing I have ever known, and I mean to spend the rest of my days proving myself worthy of the trust you placed in a stranger's locked door." "I take you, Hugh Brenner," Lillian answered, her own voice steady despite the tears sliding freely down her cheeks, "as the man who did not need to know my whole story to offer me shelter, and who loved me enough afterward to help me reclaim it. You gave me back my life, Hugh, and I intend to spend the whole of it, every remaining day, giving you every reason to be glad you did." The years that followed were not without their ordinary hardships, the kind every ranching family in that wild and beautiful country came to know. Hard winters that tested the herd and their own endurance alike. A drought year that had them hauling water from the creek by hand for weeks on end. The small griefs of animals lost and crops failed. But they weathered every one of it together, and the ranch at Brenner Ridge grew and prospered under their combined labor, Lillian proving as capable with cattle and horses as she had once proven capable of surviving on her own across 3 hard territories. Their first child, a son they named Thomas after Hugh's father, was born in the spring of 1881, in the same bedroom where Lillian had first slept that stormy night 2 years before, with Doreen Holloway, who had come to live nearby in a small house Hugh helped her build on the edge of their land, serving as midwife and doting honorary grandmother both. 2 years after that came a daughter, whom they named Grace, in quiet acknowledgement of the mercy that had carried them through their long ordeal, and 3 years after Grace came a second son, cheerful and stubborn from his very first breath, whom they named Ezra in honor of the marshal who had never stopped believing in the justice of their cause, even when the law itself had seemed determined to fail them. Marshal Ezra Coombs remained a close friend of the family for the rest of his years, godfather in every meaningful sense to the boy who bore his name, and he often told the story, in later years, of the night a woman had ridden into his territory pursued by a bounty that never should have existed, and how justice, when it was finally allowed to work as it was meant to, had proven strong enough after all to overcome even a rich man's determined corruption. He liked to say it restored something in his own faith in the badge he wore, a faith that had wavered more than once over the long, hard years of frontier lawkeeping. Hugh never returned to wearing a badge himself, content instead to build his life around the ranch and the family that grew there. Though he did, in later years, serve 2 terms as a territorial representative, advocating for reforms to prevent exactly the kind of privately funded bounty abuse that had so nearly cost him the woman he loved. He spoke often in those legislative halls of Tobias Ray's, the rancher he had once helped escape an unjust hanging, and though he never did learn what became of that man in the years after his flight to Mexico, he liked to think, and told Lillian more than once, that somewhere south of the border a man was living free with his family because one deputy had refused to be complicit in a lie, just as he had refused, years later, to turn away a desperate woman pounding on his door in a thunderstorm. Lillian, for her part, became something of a quiet fixture in the growing community of Cedar Bluff, known for her willingness to help any woman in the territory who found herself in circumstances she herself had once known too well, offering shelter and counsel, and when needed, the kind of practical assistance that came from having survived exactly the kind of danger such women faced. More than one frightened young wife found her way, over the years, to the door of the Brenner ranch, drawn by whispered word of a woman there who would understand without judgment and help, without asking too many questions before offering shelter. Lillian never turned one away, and Hugh, remembering his own decision on that first stormy night, never once suggested that she should. On the evening of their 10th wedding anniversary, in the autumn of 1889, Hugh and Lillian sat together on the same porch where he had first told her he loved her, watching their 3 children chase fireflies across the darkening yard while Doreen Halloway, gray-haired and slower now, but no less sharp-tongued, called out fond warnings from her rocking chair about muddy boots and bedtime hours. The ranch had grown considerably in 10 years, the herd doubled, a second barn built, a schoolhouse established close enough that Thomas and Grace no longer had to board in town during the week, and Ezra, still too young for school, content to trail after his older siblings with the fierce devotion of a little brother determined to keep up. "Do you ever think of that night?" Lillian asked, leaning against Hugh's shoulder as the last light faded from the ridge above them. "The storm, and how frightened I was, and how certain I was that you would send me away the moment you understood the danger I brought with me." "I think of it often," Hugh said, wrapping his arm around her, the same gesture he had made 1,000 times in the years since, and one that still, after all this time, made her heart feel lighter for the weight of it. "I think of how close I came to losing everything that matters most to me now, simply because I might have hesitated one moment longer before unbolting that door. I have never been more grateful for a decision made in half a second than I am for that one." "You did not hesitate at all," Lillian reminded him. "You looked past my shoulder into that storm, and you stepped back, and you let me in before I had even finished explaining why you shouldn't." "I suppose I knew, even then," Hugh said, "that whatever trouble you carried with you was worth far less than whatever good you might bring with you once the trouble was settled. I have never regretted that instinct for a single day since." "Nor have I regretted trusting it," Lillian said, and turned her face up to kiss him softly in the deepening dark, while their children's laughter drifted up from the yard below, and the cattle settled for the night in the pastures beyond, and the ridge that had given the ranch its name stood dark and steady against the last light of the western sky, exactly as it had stood on that first stormy night, and exactly as it would stand for all the years of happiness that followed. Long after the bounty poster that had once threatened to end everything had faded to nothing more than an old, forgotten story, told now only as proof that even the deepest injustice could, with enough courage and enough love, finally be set right. They lived out their years at Brenner Ridge, watching Thomas grow into a steady, capable rancher very much in his father's mold, watching Grace grow into a sharp, compassionate young woman who eventually trained as a teacher and took over the very schoolhouse her childhood had helped establish, watching Ezra grow restless and adventurous in a way that eventually carried him west to see more of the territory his parents had once crossed in desperate flight. Though he always returned home for the holidays with stories that made his mother laugh and his father shake his head with fond exasperation. Doreen Halloway lived to see all three grandchildren, as she insisted on calling them, into their own adulthoods before she passed peacefully in her sleep at the age of 78, mourned by the whole family as though she had been born to it rather than adopted into it by circumstance and love. And Hugh Brenner and Lillian Easton, who had become Lillian Brenner on that bright autumn day in Cedar Bluff so many years before, grew old together on the same ridge where their story had begun. Two people who had found in each other not just safety from a world's injustice, but a partnership strong enough to face down that injustice and win, and a love deep enough to outlast every storm that had ever threatened to tear it apart before it had even properly begun. They never did forget the night a desperate confession and a bolted door had changed the whole course of both their lives, and they told the story often, to their children and eventually their grandchildren, always ending it the same way, with Hugh's hand finding Lillian's across whatever table or porch or fireside they happened to be sitting beside, and the simple, certain words that had proven true through every hardship the years had brought them. "I locked that door to keep the danger out," Hugh would say, "but what I found on the other side of it was the best thing that ever walked into my life." And Lillian, every single time, would smile the same smile she had first shown him on that stormy night so long ago, and answer, "And I found the one place in this whole wide territory where I never had to run again."